Welcome to the Knight Gambit TV. Today, we are analyzing a phenomenal clash between two of India's brightest chess superstars. Grandmaster Pragnanandha R playing with the white pieces and Grandmaster GUKESH D playing with the black pieces. This game was played at the 2026 Super Rapid and Blitz Croatia tournament. Let's break down this masterpiece move by move. Attention everyone, the Knight Gambit TV isn't just a chess channel. It's a place to build stronger players. Our mission is not simply to make money, but to help every chess lover improve their understanding of the game. Every video is designed to teach powerful tactics, opening ideas, strategic plans, endgame techniques, and real grandmaster lessons in a simple way. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced player, you'll find valuable knowledge to sharpen your skills and confidence. Subscribe to the Knight Gambit TV, learn something new with every video, and take your chess to the next level. Knowledge first. Stronger players. Better chess. Part 1. The opening battle, moves 1 to 10. 1 d4. White starts by advancing the queen's pawn to d4, staking an immediate claim in the center of the board and opening lines for the dark-squared bishop. 1 in f6. Black responds by developing the king's knight to f6. This flexible move controls the central e4 and d5 squares, preventing white from immediately expanding with a second central pawn. 2. c4. White pushes the c-pawn to c4, putting extra pressure on the central squares and preparing to gain space on the queen side. 2 e6. Black opens a pathway for the dark-squared bishop by moving the e-pawn to e6, while preparing to fight for the d5 square. 3. Knight c3. White develops the queen's knight to c3. This active development threatens to push the e-pawn to e4 next to grab total dominance over the center. 3. Bishop b4. Black counters by jumping the king's bishop to b4, pinning the white knight to the king. This is the hallmark of the classic Nimzo-Indian defense, neutralizing white's central plans. 4 e3. White responds with the Rubinstein system, moving the e-pawn to e3 to solidify the center and open up the path for the light-squared bishop. 4 do. Black gets the king to safety by castling on the king side, completing early development. 5. Bishop d3. White brings out the king's bishop to d3, aiming at the h7 square and creating an aggressive setup. 5 c5. Black strikes at white's central d4 pawn by advancing the c-pawn to c5, testing white's structural integrity. 6. Knight f3. White develops the king's knight to f3, preparing kingside castling and reinforcing the d4 center. 6 d6. Black plays a solid positional move, pushing the d-pawn to d6 to create a firm defensive wall and support the e5 square. 7. Queen c2. White places the queen on c2, a typical square that coordinates with the dark-squared bishop and exerts control over the e4 square. 7. Knight c6. Black develops the queen's knight to c6, applying pressure to white's d4 pawn and aiming for future central action. 8. Low. White moves the king to safety by castling kingside, completing the first major phase of development. 8. Bishop takes c3. Black chooses to capture the white knight on c3 using the dark-squared bishop, forcing white to fix their structure. 9. Queen takes c3. White recaptures with the queen on c3, avoiding doubled pawns and keeping a very clean pawn skeleton. 9 e5. Black aggressively strikes the center by pushing the e-pawn to e5, forcing concrete pawn contact. 10. D takes e5. White eliminates the tension by capturing the black e5 pawn with the d4 pawn. 10 d takes e5. Black recaptures the e5 pawn with the d6 pawn, restoring material balance.
Part 2. Middle game maneuvers. Moves 11 to 25. 11. Knight d2. White shifts the king's knight to d2. This positional retreat clears the path for white's light-squared bishop while eyeing the c4 and e4 squares. 11. Bishop e6. Black develops the light-squared bishop to e6, aiming directly at white's queenside structure. 12. b3. White advances the b-pawn to b3, intending to place the dark-squared bishop on b2 for a long-range diagonal attack. 12. Queen d7. Black positions the queen on d7, connecting the major pieces and preparing to utilize the d-file. 13. Knight e4. White jumps the knight to e4, threatening the f6 knight and seeking an exchange to loosen black's defenses. 13. Knight takes e4. Black accepts the challenge, using the king's knight to capture white's e4 knight. 14. Bishop takes e4. White captures back with the king's bishop on e4, placing it on a highly dominant central outpost. 14. Rook f8. Black slides the king's rook to e8 to support the e5 pawn, keeping options open for the other pieces. 15. Bishop a3. White develops the dark-squared bishop to a3, creating an immediate tactical attack against black's c5 pawn. 15. b6. Black easily defends the threatened c5 pawn by moving the b pawn to b6. 16. Rook a d1. White takes control of the open file by moving the queen's rook to d1, actively targeting black's queen. 16. Queen c7. Black steps out of the alignment by moving the queen to c7, keeping an eye on the central files. 17. Bishop b2. White repositions the dark-squared bishop to b2, dialing up the pressure directly against black's e5 pawn. 17. f6. Black solidifies the center by pushing the f-pawn to f6, making the e5 pawn completely safe. 18. Queen d3. White coordinates a direct attack on black's kingside by placing the queen on d3, threatening the h7 pawn. 18. h6. Black safely sidesteps the threat by nudging the h-pawn to h6. 19. Queen d6. White aggressively invades black's territory by parking the queen on d6, forcing a major piece trade. 19. Rook a c8. Black defends the queen by moving the queen's rook to c8. 20. Bishop g6. White creates a nuisance by lunging the light-squared bishop to g6, attacking the black rook. 20. Rook e7. Black maneuvers the king's rook to e7, blocking the threat and preparing to double rooks. 21. Queen takes c7. White triggers the exchange by capturing black's queen on c7. 21. Rook e takes c7. Black recaptures the white queen using the king's rook on c7. 22. Rook d6. White commands the open territory by sliding the king's rook deep into d6, harassing black's light-squared bishop. 22. Knight e7. Black creatively counters by jumping the queen's knight to e7, counterattacking white's light-squared bishop. 23. Bishop h5. White retreats the light-squared bishop to h5, keeping the asset safe on an active diagonal. 23. Rook c6. Black challenges white's active rook by sliding the king's rook to c6. 24. Rook d2. White opts to preserve the rook, pulling the king's rook back to d2 to maintain presence on the file. 24. Knight f5. Black positions the queen's knight to f5, looking to leap into key central squares. 25. Rook fd1. White doubles the artillery, moving the queen's rook to d1 to claim complete ownership of the d-file. 25. King f8. Black brings the king to f8, inching closer to the center as the endgame approaches.
Part 3. Positional pressure and tension. Moves 26 to 40. 26. Bishop f3. White relocates the light-squared bishop to f3, taking a direct aim at black's rook on c6. 26. Rook 6, c7. Black smoothly tucks the king's rook back to c7 to escape the bishop's gaze. 27. Bishop e2. White pulls the light-squared bishop back to e2, patiently keeping options open for structural changes. 27. Rook e8. Black readjusts, moving the queen's rook to e8 to reinforce the back lines. 28. Bishop c3. White maneuvers the dark-squared bishop to c3, staring down the queen side. 28. Knight e7. Black cycles the queen's knight back to e7, reinforcing key entry squares. 29. g4. White aggressively gains space on the king side by pushing the g-pawn to g4. 29. a5. Black secures queenside structural space by advancing the a-pawn to a5. 30. King g2. White activates the king to g2, standard operating procedure for late-stage endgames. 30. Knight c6. Black returns the queen's knight to c6, aiming at the b4 and d4 squares. 31. h4. White expands further by moving the h-pawn to h4, preparing a kingside pawn storm. 31. a4. Black creates counterplay by striking the queenside with the a-pawn to a4. 32. King g3. White steps up with the king to g3, showing solid king safety and positioning. 32. Rook a8. Black shifts the queen's rook to an active attacking file on a8. 33. Bishop f3. White resets the light-squared bishop to f3, pinning the knight to the c8 square. 33. King e7. Black advances the king to e7, offering maximum protection to his pieces. 34. Rook d6. White swings the king's rook down to d6, putting critical pressure on the pinned knight. 34. Rook ac8. Black drops the queen's rook back to c8 to safeguard the defense. 35. Rook 1d2. White doubles down on stability by reinforcing with the queen's rook to d2. 35. A takes b3. Black opens up lines by capturing white's b3 pawn with the a4 pawn. 36. A takes b3. White recaptures with the a2 pawn to b3, keeping a compact pawn setup. 36. Bishop d7. Black steps the light-squared bishop to d7, reinforcing key tactical lines. 37. Bishop e4. White swings the light-squared bishop to e4, probing for an entry point. 37. Bishop e8. Black shifts the light-squared bishop back to e8, cementing an impenetrable defense. 38. f4. White breaks with the f-pawn to f4, attempting to pierce through black's central chain. 38. E takes f4 check. Black defuses the immediate tension by capturing white's f4 pawn with the e5 pawn. 39. E takes f4. White recaptures with the e3 pawn to f4, keeping control of the central squares. 39. Rook d8. Black forces an ultimate rook showdown by moving the queen's rook to d8. 40. Rook takes d8. White obliges, capturing black's d8 rook using the king's rook. 40. Knight takes d8. Black recaptures with the queen's knight to d8, keeping the balance perfectly intact.
Part 4. Deep Endgame Stratagems. Moves 41 to 55. 41. f5. White clamps down on space by pushing the f-pawn to f5, trying to lock black's pieces away. 41. Bishop c6. Black challenges white's prized piece by placing the light-squared bishop on c6. 42. Bishop c2. White avoids the trade, hiding the light-squared bishop back on c2 to preserve attacking options. 42. Knight f7. Black maneuvers the queen's knight to f7, targeting the critical e5 and d6 entry outposts. 43. King f4. White aggressively brings the king up to f4 to act as an active attacking unit. 43. Rook a7. Black controls the fully open a file by swinging the king's rook to a7. 44. Bishop b2. White positions the dark-squared bishop to b2 to protect the lower ranks. 44. Rook a8. Black carefully shifts the king's rook back to a8, playing a waiting game of high-level maneuvering. 45. Rook e2 check. White checks the black king by sliding the queen's rook to e2. 45. King d7. Black calmly walks the king to d7, out of harm's way. 46. Bishop b1. White pulls the light-squared bishop to b1, safeguarding the queenside entry points. 46. Rook a7. Black patiently stays steady, returning the king's rook to a7. 47. Rook d2 check. White checks again, positioning the queen's rook on d2. 47. King e7. Black steps the king right back to e7, proving there is no way through. 48. Rook d1. White slides the queen's rook back to d1, looking for a different angle. 48. Rook a8. Black mirrors the patience, returning the king's rook to a8. 49. Rook e1 check. White checks a third time, clicking the queen's rook to e1. 49. King d7. Black safely guides the king back to d7. 50. Rook e6. White chooses to invade deeper, positioning the queen's rook to e6. 50. Knight d8. Black fights back by lunging the queen's knight to d8, booting the aggressive rook. 51. Rook e3. White retreats the queen's rook to e3, maintaining a strong defensive baseline. 51. Knight f7. Black returns the queen's knight to f7, holding down the fort. 52. Rook e2. White clocks the queen's rook back to e2 to rethink the breakthrough plan. 52. Rook a7. Black moves the king's rook to a7, keeping steady hands. 53. Bishop d3. White adjusts the light-squared bishop to d3, aiming across the board. 53. Rook a8. Black brings the king's rook to a8, completely mirroring white's structural shifts. 54. Rook d2. White positions the queen's rook to d2, staring down the d-file line. 54. King e7. Black returns the king to e7, eliminating any potential tactical surprises. 55. Bishop e4. White finally offers a major bishop exchange by placing the light-squared bishop on e4. 55. Bishop takes e4. Black confidently trades, eliminating white's asset with the light-squared bishop.
Part 5. The final simplification to a draw. Moves 56 to 70. 56. King takes e4. White recaptures using the king on e4, maintaining an active centralized king. 56. Knight d6 check. Black delivers a sharp check by jumping the queen's knight to d6. 57. King f4. White steps the king back to f4 to dodge the knight fork. 57. Rook a7. Black moves the king's rook to a7, maintaining an excellent defensive profile. 58. Rook e2 check. White checks the king one more time, sliding the queen's rook to e2. 58. King d7. Black tucks the king away safely on d7. 59. g5. White tries one last desperation breakthrough by pushing the g-pawn to g5. 59. H takes g5 check. Black quickly liquidates by capturing with the h6 pawn to g5. 60. H takes g5. White recaptures with the f4 pawn to g5. 60. Rook a2. Black actively invades white's second rank by anchoring the king's rook on a2, pinning white's dark-squared bishop. 61. Rook d2. White creates a pin of his own, locking black's knight by moving the queen's rook to d2. 61. King c6. Black walks the king up to c6 to break the pinning mechanism. 62. G takes f6. White captures the f6 pawn with the g5 pawn, threatening to promote. 62. G takes f6. Black cleanly recaptures using the f6 pawn, stopping the threat. 63. Bishop c3. White blocks the rook's pressure by offering a rook trade with the dark-squared bishop on c3. 63. Rook takes d2. Black happily trades off the major pieces, capturing the queen's rook with the king's rook. 64. Bishop takes d2. White recaptures with the dark-squared bishop on d2. 64. b5. Black breaks open the remaining queenside pawns by advancing the b-pawn to b5. 65. Bishop c3. White targets black's isolated f6 pawn by setting the dark-squared bishop on c3. 65. B takes c4. Black trades pawns, capturing on c4 with the b5 pawn. 66. B takes c4. White recaptures on c4 using the c4 pawn. 66. Knight takes c4. Black eliminates another target, capturing white's c4 pawn with the queen's knight. 67. Bishop takes f6. White cleans up the f6 pawn with the dark-squared bishop, creating a dangerous passed pawn. 67. Knight d6. Black places the queen's knight on d6, completely blocking the path of white's passed pawn. 68. Bishop e7. White moves the dark-squared bishop to e7, attacking the blocking knight. 68. Knight takes f5. Black plays a tactical simplification, capturing white's remaining f5 pawn using the queen's knight. 69. Bishop takes c5. White captures black's queen's knight with the dark-squared bishop. 69. King takes c5. Black recaptures white's dark-squared bishop using the king. 70. King takes f5. White collects the last remaining black pawn with the king, leaving absolutely zero checkmating material on the board. A brilliant, flawless positional draw between two of India's top chess prodigies. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more breakdowns here on the Knight Gambit TV. Thank you so much for watching my video. God bless everyone.